Here. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really excited to be hosting tonight's discussion between Benjamin S. Case, author of Street Rebellion, Resistance Beyond Violence and Nonviolence, and movement scholar and educator Hillary Lazar. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're a queer and feminist collective that strives to feature books and events that reflect our interests and the needs of marginalized communities in the South. We ship books all across the country, and our entire catalog is available to browse on our website, which I will drop a link to in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space. We are continuing to offer virtual events online, both because we love connecting with people at a distance, and because we know COVID continues to be a barrier for many in our community. So next Thursday, we're hosting what should be a really engaging and informative virtual event to celebrate the release of The Sentences That Create Us, Crafting a Writer's Life in Prison, which is a new volume out from Haymarket Books about how authors and others can connect with and mentor incarcerated writers. So for anyone who's interested in signing up for that or any other event happening through Firestorm, I will also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. And for those of you who are here tonight in the live audience, our speakers are excited to field your questions about the book and their discussion. So I'll encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion at any point using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're following along on Zoom, or in the comments if you're following along on the live stream. Great. Moving on to tonight's event then. We are living in a time of uprisings that routinely involve physical confrontation. Burning vehicles, barricades, vandalism, and scuffles between protesters and authorities. Yet the left has struggled to incorporate rioting into theories of change, remaining stuck in recurring debates over violence and nonviolence. Civil resistance studies have popularized the term strategic nonviolence, spreading the notion that violence is wholly counterproductive. Street Rebellion, the book we're talking about tonight, scrutinizes recent research and develops a broad and grounded portrait of the relationship between strategic nonviolence and rioting in the struggle for liberation. Benjamin S. Case is an organizer, educator, and writer. He is a researcher at the Center for Work and Democracy and a fellow at the Resistance Studies Initiative. Hillary Lazar is a longtime educator, organizer, and movement scholar. She is co-editor of Perspectives on Anarchist Theory, is on the advisory board for the Institute for Anarchist Studies and Anarchist Agency PR project, and is a member of the Mutual Aid Speakers series. Hillary teaches sociology at the University of Pittsburgh, and her research focuses on historical and contemporary anarchism, movement evaluation, and the politics of emotions. So Ben, Hillary, thank you so much for being here tonight and having this discussion and sharing your insights with us. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Hillary.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks so much for that, Ash. And thanks to everyone who's here this evening and to Firestorm for hosting this conversation. And of course, thanks to you, Ben, for inviting me to be here for part of this event. I can't express enough how excited I am to be here to help celebrate the launch of Street Rebellion. It really is just a terrific book, and it makes any number of very powerful critical interventions into understanding current thought and practice, specifically around how to build power from below, while engaging and revisiting with that longstanding question of violence and nonviolence in really interesting and new and important ways. So I'm very much looking forward to having the opportunity to both celebrate this and dive into all these important points that you're uplifting in Street Rebellion. So congratulations again. You know, as you well know, and quite honestly, I've been watching the evolution of this project really since its earliest phases in informal conversations over beers in early grad school together as comrades in the street even, right? But the truth is that I don't actually know the origin stories for it. I knew when it started percolating as a question for you, where you began to question and take on, like, head on, this question of violence and nonviolence, and what you've ended up doing in Street Rebellion through painstaking research and analysis is really restore the value of the riot to conversations around movement building, and really kind of critically interrogating and exploding this idea of this popular perception, what you call the myth of strategic nonviolence, that's become so prevalent on the mainstream left, that strategic nonviolence is really the only avenue, the only viable, effective path of resistance. And in so doing, you as Akin Ola says, flip the entire field of civil resistance studies on its head, right? So I've seen the evolution of this, but I don't know the origins. What was it that initially inspired you to start thinking about this, Ben, right? Why did we start having those conversations early on? Was it your work as an organizer in the street? Was it what we were encountering in grad school and kind of that ubiquitous myth of strategic nonviolence, that was the only way we could build movement, that we should teach our students, right? What was it? And adding on to that, what do you even mean by riot, right? What is street rebellion? Because of course there are any number of ways of defining this, right? The authorities and powers that be would say that a riot is a crowd disturbance. But of course you flip that and say, actually, a riot is disturbing the facade of peace and the underlying injustice. So, right, how did you come to that? So help us walk through the basics. What inspired you, and what do you kind of mean by this all?
Yeah, great. That's a lot. Before getting to that, I also just want to reiterate thanking Ash and Firestorm and AK Press for hosting this, and everyone here joining us. And you, Hillary, it's so great to be here in conversation with you. It's a joy to be talking with all of you. I'm only sorry that it can't be in person, but hopefully with everyone here at some point in the not too distant future. I guess the story sort of begins in Occupy. You might not be shocked to hear, Hillary, as a scholar and participant in Occupy yourself. But after Occupy in New York City, which I was part of, and after the organizing projects that kind of spun out of that, I made the maybe questionable decision to come to graduate school. I saw it at the time as a chance to step back for a moment and reflect on the moment that had just happened in Occupy, and also develop some research skills that I could use to analyze some of the conflicts that I saw as holding the movement back. And I ended up on the violence nonviolence debate, in part because I saw the ways that that movements, not just Occupy, but movements reading back across history, deal with this recurring debate over and over, and seeing the ways that movements on the left and the broader public really tie ourselves in knots around the questions of violence and nonviolence in very similar ways every time riots are erupting. but also because it was an area where I thought that research could really help. I thought that research could help clear things up, that addressing this issue through research and writing could hopefully make a significant impact. This was a time when Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan's book, Why Civil Resistance Works, was making a big splash. There was a time that research was everywhere. It was all over the news. It was in articles. It was in nonviolent direct action trainings. It was all over the place. And the central takeaway was nonviolence works better. This was coming out in a moment of global uprising. Right? 2011 was this moment when we had these just momentous, earth-shattering movements kicking off all over the world, right? Starting in Tunisia and Egypt at the beginning of that year and spreading throughout North Africa and the Levant and Europe and Greece and Spain, in Nigeria and Canada and the US, all over the place. There were these movements erupting. And this field of study called civil resistance studies or nonviolent studies, which had been sort of marginal, really stepped into the light to interpret this moment for us. And they were sort of taking the microphone and interpreting what was happening for academics, for the policy world, for the media, and for activists. And that interpretation was the size and the success of these movements was due to their nonviolent tactics. Right? That was the idea. This was a turn toward nonviolent methods. That struck me as wrong, in part because I was part of these movements and I knew that diversity of tactics was part of what was happening, but also because I knew that the violence-nonviolence debate was very much alive and in fact was boiling within these movements. It certainly was not a settled issue. But the research that was being put out by Chenoweth and Stefan, and really Erica Chenoweth is sort of the person behind the data work and who's become the sort of the unofficial champion of this argument. They were saying that this isn't a question of opinion or preference. This is empirical research. This is research that says that in the past century plus, movements that have challenged governments are more successful when they're nonviolent. This argument was being made at a time when I also think that people were really compelled by the language of efficacy. I think young people and activists, there's a lot of dire problems going on and people feel a lot of urgency. And there's this idea like we need to know what works. And so when we're being told this is what works, there is a strategic package that is designed for winning. And in fact, it actually is made up of the most accessible and easy ways to participate in that change, right? Showing up to nonviolent protests, it's bound to be influential, and it was very influential. So as I dug through the data, as I show in the book, that this data is actually being very much misrepresented. This is not what this science is saying. Which we can get into the weeds on that if you want or if folks want, but the basic idea is that riots are ignored and other types of things that aren't nonviolent but also aren't armed struggle, aren't warfare, like strategic sabotage or things like that, completely disappear in this research. Or they don't disappear, they're actually rolled into the effects of what's being called nonviolent, but they're not being called that. Then the same research was getting turned around and used to argue that riots were going to hurt movements on the basis that they were violent. So there was this conceptual slippage that was I saw as really playing a destructive role in people's understandings of what was happening. And so that was really the impetus for me starting to go down this road of unpacking some of these arguments around strategic nonviolence. But of course, riots aren't just interesting because they're left out of this research, right? Riots raise people's collective pulse. People catch feelings about rioting. People have strong opinions. This is something that movement scholars call polarization. Not like the polarization you hear about with like Democrats and Republicans, but polarization of these sort of latent ideas and views and cleavages in society that are sort of under the current. There's certain events that bring those to the fore, where those now become a public debate. And riots are one of the main types of actions that can have that effect, that bring out these underlying tensions in society. Riots are a major narrative mechanism in fictions. Everyone knows what a riot looks like, whether or not you've actually seen one because of the news, because of media, in movies or TV shows. If you're trying to convey popular discontent, if you're trying to convey unrest, the riot is the narrative mechanism to do it. So these are really important events. They go on all over the world. They go on back through time, but there's actually surprisingly little research on riots. There certainly is, and there's even less research on rioters. Of course, there is. It's not to say that there isn't any. There is, and there's some fantastic research that in many ways I stand on the shoulders of, specifically concerning Black Bloc tactics and anarchists, right? Thinking of people like A.K. Thompson and Francis Dupuis-Derry and Sean McFessel and Mark Bray with his book on Antifa. And then some more recent works that have, I think, really helped to change the conversation, like Elizabeth Hinton's book, America on Fire, which centers urban rebellion in the histories of Black struggles for freedom in the US, and Vicky Osterwell's book, In Defense of Looting, which specifically focuses on narratives and discourses around looting as part of riots. So works like this have done a lot of work in changing these conversations. But we still need more focused, grounded research on rioting and rioters, at least as I saw it. So this is sort of the story behind kind of how I got into this research. And then what is a riot? That's right. So obviously the book has sort of a fuller answer here. But I guess, so you introduced this really well, that the riot is often discussed as this disturbance of the peace. And I want to look at it as, what is that peace that's being disturbed? And when we actually look at what's happening in riots and the type of riots I'm examining, they're almost always a response to police violence against communities or against acute deprivation, things being withheld from communities. So that condition of peace really isn't peace. But it feels like peace to some people, and riots sort of break through that or try to break through that. Definitionally, I'm looking at, sort of two main things. One is just, it's a collective action that's not nonviolent, but it's also not armed struggle. It's not a military formation. And, riots across time and space have remarkably similar repertoires of action, which is interesting in and of itself. But, going back a long way, riots they're protests where people are throwing objects at authorities, or people are setting things on fire, vehicles or buildings. People are building barricades in the streets or physically scuffling with authorities. So that's one part of it. And the other part that's important to mention is the direction that systemic power is flowing through an action. So there's many types of actions where people are, in the streets setting things on fire and throwing things. That doesn't mean they're all the same exact type of thing, but a lot of times they all get called riots, and it's important to distinguish what's going on here. So the sorts of riots I'm looking at, which you could call anti-police riots, are you could say are punching up against systemic power. There's another type of action, which is punching down, which sometimes get called riots, where members of a dominant racial or ethnic group attack members of or terrorize members of a marginalized community and destroy their neighborhoods. There's awful examples of this all across the world. In the US, we could think of like a famous example being like the Tulsa massacre in 1921, or other similar things like are called race riots a century ago in the US, where white communities would terrorize Black communities. We could think of anti-Jewish riots in Europe during the same era, or more recently anti-Muslim riots in India, or anti-foreigner riots in South Africa, or Israeli settlers terrorizing Palestinians. Or there's a lot of examples of this type of thing. Sometimes this gets called rioting, but it's a fundamentally different type of socio-political event. And I think it's really important to distinguish on the basis of the disposition of authorities. And so when you look at, so I call this idea of a dominant, racial or ethnic community attacking a marginalized community, just for the sake of clarity, I call that a pogrom. And I call what you call an anti-police riot, I just call a riot. In a pogrom, a lot of times authorities are either, not responding intentionally, or intentionally showing up late, or not responding too harshly, or in some cases are participating themselves. And that changes the political dynamics of what's going on versus a riot where people are actually fighting against authorities, or fighting against, symbols or of capital or businesses, and then authorities come to defend them, and then you're fighting with authorities. So I've been talking for a while, but that's that's a basic definition of a riot I'm working with.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I mean, I think that's so helpful to make that really important distinction, because what I took out of the book is that you're really interested in exploring that idea of building power from below, and the way in which we can situate the riot into that conversation, right? Which is, as you're pointing out here, very distinct from the ways in which similar types of activities per se, but the ways in which that can be leveraged to reify dynamics of oppression, domination as an extension of the state, an extension of that kind of structural violence, right? And that's not what you're trying to uplift here. That may exist, but it's distinct from the important value of what you're highlighting here. Yeah. Without kind of getting too much into the weeds, but I still think it's important to get to, I did want to talk a little bit more about the specifics of your critiques of kind of the major literature, right, on and arguments around strategic nonviolence, right? Because the first couple of key chapters in your work specifically look at kind of the problems with this dominant discourse, and in particular take on Gene Sharp's, a couple of the canonical texts, right, that are used very widely on the ground by movement trainers and organizers, including Gene Sharp's The Politics of Nonviolent Action, which is basically like this book that's used as this kind of tactical field guide practically, right? And was seen as critical for the Egyptian revolution in 2011 that you were just talking about, and kind of defining how things were going in Tahrir Square, as well as the Occupy movement, right? It was really upheld in that moment. And then also, of course, Chenoweth and Stevens' work on civil resistance, nonviolent civil resistance, and this idea of and I think you referenced it, the 3.5% rule, right? That if you get 3.5% of the population out into the streets, right, that you can topple regime. And that because of this, almost this equation, right? That's how you incite revolution from the left, right? And essentially, in those couple of chapters, you pretty much eviscerate these arguments and really find the problematic argumentation there. And you reference the conceptual slippage. But what I was hoping for you to do, without belaboring it, but for those of us who are perhaps a little bit less data head in our orientation and a little bit less steeped in the quantitative analysis, I was hoping that you could walk us through some of the key findings that your research really intervenes with. What can you kind of unpack, decode a little bit of your data and findings for us so we see the ways in which you problematize those arguments? Because to me, that is such a core part of what you're doing. You're trying to provide these tools for those of us who are interested in growing strong movements. And you're making this argument that, everybody we're armed with kind of inaccurate research. It's pointing us in the wrong direction. So help direct us towards what is the problem with the direction that research has taken us in, and how does yours help to write that story?
Sure, but first, please, just cut me off if it's too much, because I spent now so many years with my face in these data sets that I'll just start, cut me off when it gets to be too much. You just make me get to the point.
Let's go for layperson speak, right?
Yeah. I'll try to be concise. The idea of strategic nonviolence, the important thing to sort of ground that in with Gene Sharp's work, who's really the one who came up with this framework that until today is almost unchanged for a lot of folks in the strategic nonviolent field. The real innovation was separating strategic nonviolence from moral nonviolence. So this idea of it's not about changing the hearts of the oppressor. It's not about personal transcendence or preference for nonviolence or religious commitment to nonviolence. It's a question of what works better. And so the argument that Gene Sharp is advancing is that nonviolent techniques work better to destabilize or overthrow governments. It's theoretical work. It's written like a field manual, as you say. It's this 3-volume tome, The Politics of Nonviolent Action from 1973. I spend chapter 2 unpacking that and all of its issues. What Chenoweth does, Chenoweth and Stefan in the book, but then really Chenoweth has really taken this and run with it in their career, is try to empirically validate this. So it's saying that, so Sharp wrote the arguments. They don't all put it on Sharp, but those arguments come from Sharp. They take that and say, okay, well, let's look at it. Let's look over the past century. The original data set goes from 1900 to 2006. And since then, they've extended it up until almost the present. And the idea was, let's look at violent movements and nonviolent movements and see which works better. So they have these two categories. The violent category comes from other pre-existing data sets, mostly one called the Correlates of War data set, which just catalogs interstate wars, civil wars. So that's the violent conflict. These are armed struggles between two armed groups, two militaries that are fighting and shooting each other with a significant amount of casualties on both sides. That's violent struggle. They compose the other part themselves, which is the part that's meant to be nonviolent. They first say primarily nonviolent, but then go on to just say nonviolent, which is civilian uprisings, mass protests in the streets. So that's nonviolent. And they compare them for which they're talking about maximalist struggle, as they call it. So we're talking about movements that overthrow governments or aim to overthrow governments. And they find that the unarmed movements, nonviolent movements, are twice as likely to overthrow governments as violent movements, with the trend line moving toward them being even more effective than that. There's a lot of problems with that data set, which I go into in the book. But the main issue for our purposes is that there's a lot of actions that are not nonviolent within those nonviolent movements. It's just not a war. And in and of itself, that wouldn't be problematic, except, as I said, for the fact that that research gets then turned around and used to argue against actions like rioting or confronting fascists or things like that, which would not be in the violent category in that data set. They would be in the nonviolent category. They would just kind of disappear into that category. So there's no variable for riots or anything like that in the data. So the first thing I did is I added in riots from a different data set that catalogs riots based on media reports, to show that the vast majority of these campaigns that are being called nonviolent involve major riots, including the vast majority of successful ones. So we're not really talking about nonviolence. We're talking about unarmed movements, right? That's the first thing that's important. And then I go on to look at nonviolent protests and violent protests alongside one another, to see what the effect is, because the argument that Chenoweth and Stefan's making is actually that the driver of movement success is mass participation. It's having more people in the streets. More people in the streets more consistently, that leads to movement success. And the argument is that violent tactics demobilize people. They send people home. They frighten people away, or people don't feel able to participate, or they increase repression and that sends people home, or whatever it might be. So I was looking at, well, is that true? Let's actually look at that. Let's look at these alongside one another. So I examined data from 10 different countries across different regions and with different political systems and different histories. So I look at Brazil, China, Ethiopia, France, England, Iran, Mexico, Philippines, South Africa, and the US. I think that's all 10. And I look at nonviolent and violent protests alongside each other over time. And what you see is actually that not only do riots not demobilize people, on average, in most of these countries, most of the time, instances of riots statistically result in higher levels of nonviolent demonstration within the same year and within the subsequent year. And it's very clear when you see it graphed out. The graphs are in the book, where you see, like, when there's a spike in nonviolent demonstrations, there's almost always a spike in riots at the same time. This is kind of intuitive, right? Like, when there's a moment of uprising, people are doing a lot of things, and some of those things are not going to be violent and some are. And this is where, this is sort of where we reach the limits of what the data science can do, because at some point, the fact that we're distinguishing this hard line between violent and nonviolent is part of the problem, right? A lot of these actions, it's actually not that helpful to try to distinguish this hard line. It's only good for certain things. And so what the data is meant to show is that this idea that strict nonviolence is necessary for movement success is not backed up by the research. And in fact, what we see is that a mix of different types of protests that are more and less violent tend to go together in major moments of uprising.
Right. And I mean, kind of from my take on it, what you're doing by restoring the riot to the conversation, you're not only bringing visibility to something that's been, written out of the script, right? But you're absolutely problematizing that argument. One of the main critiques of, and I know you're trying to jettison the binary of violence, nonviolence, even that language, but one of the big critiques of violence is that, well, you're going to lose the hearts and minds, everybody, right? You're going to alienate the public at large. What's going to happen is you're going to have a demobilizing effect. And in so doing, you're going to undercut the movements that you're trying to build. And what my takeaway here is that what you're showing is that, well, when we actually write back into the story what's actually going on the ground, we're seeing, you know, what's that term? The radical flank. We can even see the radical flank effect, right? That people are actually being catalyzed to action in part by these more radical tactics and on the ground street rebellion. That it's actually a really important part of inspiring and kind of further enhancing that mobilization, that by kind of conflating these terms and this conceptual slippage, you're losing that part of the story. And so you're really kind of problematizing that popular critique.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, you know, it's hard because, you know, one of the things you find when you dig into these arguments is that, as I say in the book, like, you know, in many ways, both sides are right in this violence, nonviolence argument. I mean, there's truth to some of the arguments that, you know, violent actions, if you're talking about riots, they're scary. And they do, you know, polarize people in the sense that some people do, you know, retreat from that and want to gravitate to security. You know, the idea of security, whether that's, you know, voting for a party that they think will provide more security, or whether that's, you know, actually trying to, you know, engage in politics in some sort of a way that brings that about, whether that just means withdrawing their support from a movement. That's true. There's that element of that effect. That's part of the way social change happens. It also has other effects, though. It also might inspire some people who felt, you know, beaten down, who felt, you know, like there's no hope for alternatives, who felt the need to fight back but haven't seen a vehicle for that. There's this emotional aspect that riots can have in the other direction too, for participants certainly, but also for onlookers. And so it can lead to all these different sorts of things. So in a particular moment when there's an uprising going on, when people are focusing on, you know, these acute problems in society and that something's got to be done about that, riots can symbolize the essence of resistance in a really particular kind of way. That's especially powerful, I think, and that's one of the reasons that it's such a long-standing form of resistance. But that doesn't mean that all of the other arguments are entirely wrong. It's also true that riots tend to bring down more acute oppression in the immediate. You know, we absolutely see that, and it's also true that oftentimes that repression is going to target the most vulnerable and the most marginalized people. That's also largely true. So, you know, we see these diverging, or we're not diverging, but we see multiple impacts that can go in different directions and in different moments, you know, can have different types of broader political effects. But, you know, that's not to, so I think that the problem with the strategic nonviolent arguments is that they're only looking at these negative effects and only pointing at those and making it seem like there's nothing outside of that. That's the main problem. And the other problem, I think, is that there's this idea that there's this kind of like cookbook mentality that strategic nonviolence, you know, that it inspires. This idea that if we can correctly measure our actions, so that they're just this much disruptive, not this much disruptive, so that they're, you know, this type of messaging, this type of thing, then we can predictably, you know, grow our movement and win. And that's just not the way social change works, first of all. And second of all, you know, riots are sometimes meant strategically, like people sometimes do it on purpose, think about it ahead of time, and rioting is a part of their, you know, their political ideology, but a lot of times it's not. A lot of times it's a visceral response. And that's also really important in the long, in sort of the long history of movements for justice and liberation, is those moments of collective response to oppression. And so you can't organize that out of the repertoire. You can't, like, if it's like this idea that if we just like bombard people with enough messaging around nonviolence, they just won't do that anymore, and then movements will be more effective. It's just not. It's an ahistorical way to look at social change.
Right. Absolutely. And not only is it ahistorical, but it's kind of this false formulaic idea that, right, if you do X, Y, and Z, then you have successful revolution, right? And in this very like clean storyline, that just doesn't reflect reality. But I think to your point, and I want to come to this in a minute. I have another question first, but to your point that there's also this visceral emotional response, right? Kind of the symbolic and experiential sides to riots and rebellion that are also deeply important to kind of these riotous moments, to movements. And so I absolutely want to come to that. But before that, since we were talking about some of your responses to the critiques of violence, right? Kind of the demobilizing of the hearts and the minds, the fact that riots really are messy. I think you referred to it, that there is instrumental value, right? They can be very disruptive and potentially strategically so, but also chaotic, right? They can just happen organically in these visceral moments. Right. But also, as you pointed out, right, it can elicit extreme state response and repression that can fall disproportionately on the heads of already vulnerable peoples and communities, particularly, activists and communities of color. And I think that there is something to be said for that as a critique. But then also this relates to kind of another popular criticism and popular belief that's out there that perhaps we can problematize. But the idea of the outside agitator, the provocateur, the anarchist that comes in, the boogeyman that comes in and ruins the movement, ruins the mobilization. And so I'm curious if you've encountered that perspective. And by extension, and perhaps this is a bit inside baseball, but you often hear in movement spaces, oh well, it's kind of the kind of adventurous exploits of the white cis het dudes who want to go and have a good time, but then kind of like create a big problem for other folks on the ground. So I'm curious if you've encountered those critiques and kind of how you've engaged with that, or by extension, how folks you've spoken with, how they've engaged with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, the first thing to say is that there's some truth to all of that, right? There is some truth to the idea that there are such a thing as provocateurs. That's a real thing that happens, and movements should be cognizant of that, should know those histories, should be vigilant about that. That's a real thing. It's also true that there's there are folks who see these moments as like an opportunity to play out like a white hypermasculine fantasy, for sure. That's a thing too. And some of the folks I spoke to when I was interviewing, I have 2 interview studies in the book, one with Black Bloc participants in the US and another with student activists in South Africa. And this comes out in both of them. I mean, in South Africa, there was a very similar narrative that came out from some folks, except without the white part. It was, but still, this sort of hypermasculine, adventurous thing. So there's for sure there's some truth to all that. It tends to be sometimes folks who are not accountable to communities, more individualist sort of thing. That's really there. So again, not to discount that, but I do find it interesting. I mean, so if speaking of the inside baseball, like if we're in communities that are in these sorts of protests, then this is a thing that we should take seriously, and we should try to mitigate. And if it's folks that are part of these communities, like having those conversations about which kinds of actions are responsible and how we're accountable to each other in communities is really essential. But when the critique is coming from outside, I can't help but thinking there's a cynicism to it. It's like the idea that that right now that riots are sort of white and hypermasculine has a lot to do with the politics of now. If you rewind, about a century, the narrative was that riots are were heavily racialized in the U.S. in terms of Black people mostly, but all around the world, all sorts of places, it's racially, oppressed and marginalized communities that are being sort of looked at as the ones who are the rioters, the chaotic ones. And also in earlier crowd theory, if you read some of the crowd theory that undergirds a lot of the assumptions people have about riots, it was also feminized. The idea of riots were, this feminine impulse that people had to, some really just like wild shit that they were on at that time, about crowds sort of like, willingness to follow what anyone else did, and disorganization and irrationality and emotionality and all these sorts of things were associated with rioting. And in both cases, the goal is to disparage riots, right? Is to disparage this sort of movement actions that can really be disruptive, using language and discourses that are going to be taken to to disparage them in that time, because if you look at the histories of these things, I mean, I mentioned Elizabeth Hinton's book before, really a fantastic book that I encourage folks to read called America on Fire, where she traces the history of urban rebellions in the U.S. and Black communities against, in resistance to white supremacy and in part of the struggle for freedom for Black folks in America. This has been a major part of these struggles, has been urban rebellions. So to take that history away is also deeply problematic, or to assume that it was sparked by outsiders or something like that. It's true in the gendered way too. I mean, I interviewed folks in 2 different countries. I did not have to go out of my way to talk to people who were women or queer and trans folks who participated in riots. And that's not just now. I mean, historically, women have been participants and leaders in food riots and all sorts of riotous activity all over the world. That's a matter of history. And there's other moments that are like really important that don't fit that narrative. I mean, I think of like the Stonewall riot, for example. Like, we know that's a riot that's started by trans and queer women of color. That's a really important touchstone for an entire movement. I suspect a lot of the folks who would levy that argument also wouldn't dispute that. It's just that's in a different conversation. But we can't separate those things. So again, we have to be clear on what we're talking about, and to say that there are real problems with these things. Like systemic oppression obviously exists throughout our society. Obviously, our movements are shot through with these dynamics. There's no doubt about that. And these are things that we have to be organizing about, and we have to be talking to each other about, and we have to be accountable about. And there's like, at least in my experience in organizing, there's no shortage of toxic masculinity in nonviolence circles either, and no shortage of white supremacy culture there either. So again, these are problems that pervade a lot of movements. They're not solely that of movements that are engaging in not nonviolent tactics.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's still so much work to be done, so many critical interventions that need to happen on the ground. But I think, what comes out in your book is that there really is just a multiplicity of folks who are involved in these kind of riotous moments. And I think at one point you cite, you don't know who's out there, particularly maybe in a Black Bloc moment, right? The teacher from down the street, or the nonprofit worker, or people from right, kind of all walks of life are getting out there. But that doesn't mean, however, that as you point out, that kind of this hypermasculinity and even white supremacist kind of dynamics aren't in our movements, no doubt. That being said, right, kind of while interrogating these critiques and kind of the enduring, pervasive kind of idea that strategic nonviolence is kind of the only roadmap that's so dominant on the mainstream left. On the other hand, and you and I have talked a little bit about this in the past, I feel like, at least for me personally, what I've been observing over the last handful of years, certainly in the last decade, is that there seems to be a kind of a collapsing of prior camps, right? Even among the radical left, in that, back in the day, for example, right, the classic, Bookchin versus the insurrectionists argument, right? Social anarchist camp, it was more in line with the nonviolent direct action back in the day, perhaps. And maybe that's a myth itself, but you would see more people touting that line versus, say, kind of the crime think insurrectionist tendencies. But what I've actually observed is that there seems to be kind of a confluence of the different schools of thought coming together. And that really during the Trump era and kind of post-Trump era, that there's this idea that we kind of need to embrace all the tactics, right? And so from more militant spaces, for example, you'll see kind of an embracing of prefigurative politics and the need for mutual aid. That community defense means both armed community defense, but also providing for communities together through this practice of mutual aid and community care. On the other hand, you also, or at least I also see, right, in social, quote unquote, social anarchist spaces, the kind of embracing of, sometimes you got to punch a Nazi, right? And that we do need to take more militant action and response in the face of organized white supremacy, right? In the face of state and structural violence and the everyday devaluation of Black and brown folks, right? So at least what I've seen is that maybe on the mainstream left, it's still the story of nonviolence. But that in fact, and kind of more radical left spaces that, kind of we're all militant now in a sense. And I'm curious if you've seen that in your own conversations, your own experiences, and what your take on that is.
Yeah, 100%. I think this is an important thing to bring out because, I've been working on this research a long time. And, the truth is that things have changed and the conditions are different now than when I started this project. There's no question about that. And I think that one major thing was this rise of political fascism back into the mainstream in a way that really frightened a lot of folks. And then, Trump's presidency along with that. That the Richard Spencer punch at Disrupt J20 at Trump's inauguration was just like, that's like the definition of viral. It made everybody happy. You know what I mean? And obviously there were some arguments about it. Like that argument went on among the liberals, but like for a lot of folks, it was like, yeah. Like sometimes we need to confront these people, and like, seeing Charlottesville and those sorts of things. That really contributed, I think, a lot to people taking a much more grounded look at what we need to be doing. And then the other thing was, I think, the George Floyd uprising, or uprising that's called the George Floyd uprising a lot of times, the racial justice uprising that went global in 2020. I think that also really that changed things. I mean, in the aftermath of seeing that video of Derek Chauvin murdering George Floyd, 54% of U.S. Americans said in a poll after that people burning the third precinct was a justified response. And that's just like, that brought to the fore that rage that had been going on for years. Obviously, that's going on since the founding of this country, but acutely in recent years since Black Lives Matter. I think that moment really did change things. And those arguments happened. They came back. The same recurring arguments came back, and people, tried to do those studies that showed that such a small percentage of the protests in 2020 were violent, and that's true. But then, some people took that to mean that those were different or bad. There was the outside agitator thing. Like all these arguments came back, but at least my sense was that they were less, there was a different tone to it. And I think things are changing. I'm curious to see how that goes. I mean, one thing just to throw in is, I think for the mainstream left and for the liberal, for for the mainstream media, maybe. I hate that term. When you say terms like that, I just feel like the right now, like the right, I feel like owns these terms like mainstream media. But anyway, I'm thinking about the uprising in Iran going on right now. And I feel like a few years ago, there would be this just like torrent of civil resistance folks out here talking about how this was a nonviolent uprising, even though it clearly involves a lot of setting things on fire and a lot of rioting and fighting with security forces. I really haven't seen that so much. That just kind of doesn't seem to be part of the narrative. So I'm curious to see how this will change. I think it's a good time for the book to come out in that way, because when it started, this research really felt like it was like going through, like first through the wall on some of this stuff. And it doesn't feel like that anymore. Now it feels like the wall is crumbling, and maybe we can have these conversations in a way that's more balanced. Also, just with an eye on time, Hillary, I had it in my head to ask you also, because I know that, your work, we've talked about talking about this a lot, but we haven't actually gotten into it too much. But your work on emotions and movements, and specifically on the idea of revolutionary love or militant love, that involves a lot of these types of feelings of like connection in struggle as part of contentious movements. I'm curious what some of your reactions were to reading those parts of the book, or where your ideas went for your work based on that.
Yeah, absolutely. But and also with an eye to the time, I'd love to talk about that, the idea of what I think of as militant love. But very quickly before diving into that, I did want to say, right, you mentioned the protests in Iran, and I was thinking about that is an example of kind of the instrumental value of riotous moment, right? I mean, we saw just this week this really important shift, with the dissolution of the morality police, right? And so the question of do these more contentious moments work, right? Is there instrumental value to disruption? Perhaps. Although we have to ask at what cost, right? How many lives lost in those battles and in that repression. That being said, and this kind of shifts over to your question around my work around militant love and the relationship between love and rage. There's also, a big part of what your book speaks to, and that really, struck a chord with me and, really resonated, was this idea that you referred to of contentious effervescence, right? And the ways in which there's also this experiential element to a riotous moment. That part of what makes a riot and street rebellion so important isn't even so much what happens, right, in terms of that instrumental outcome, right, the material disruption, but what's happening to the people, to the rioters who are on the ground, and the powerful transformative effect that you were finding in having these conversations with folks in South Africa, or who were in, moments with the Black Bloc here, right, that it had this, there's this idea, right, of course, of collective effervescence, this kind of euphoria when you're engaged in kind of a moment of kind of mass convening. And kind of historically, that term comes from kind of actually religious spaces. And Durkheim, sociologist Durkheim, is talking about that. But as you've talked about in your book, that in fact people have these they were describing these moments as beautiful, as empowering, as exciting, right? That they felt alive, that they felt that they could actually make change, and that they had these deeply transformative, subjective experiences, that they had changed subjectivity that came out of these moments of collective action. And in fact, a lot of my work actually draws on some of what you do, what you write about. And it's not so much in quote unquote riotous moments, but a lot of what I've looked at and experienced as well is what I refer to as kind of moments of revolutionary rupture. And maybe there are elements of that riot, that street rebellion, but particularly at the start of movements, right? And we saw this with the Occupy movement, folks who were involved in kind of the global justice days or in Seattle, right? There are these moments where everything kind of takes a pause, right? The status quo is temporarily, in this fleeting moment, disrupted. And in those moments of collective struggle, whether it's riotous like you describe or just engaged in that kind of mass rebellion, even if it's less quote unquote violent, that there's this feeling of a powerful feeling of possibility, right? That we can do anything. And in those moments, you know, a lot of people that I talk with and that, you know, I felt myself at times, it feels like a kind of a, what I would define as a collective love. You know, you love the people that you were there on the ground with, and you feel a love for the moment and for the movement, for that revolutionary moment. And for me, tying this into this idea of militant love, that you know, some people, particularly actually coming out of nonviolent, kind of the nonviolent discourse camps, will say, well, you know, we need love. We don't need the rage and the hate of violence. But in fact, kind of what I've come to and what a lot of folks I've spoken with will say is that in fact, it's the love that's driving the action. And that love that you feel for your comrades on the ground, right, is not distinct from needing to take, in some cases, militant action. That in fact, it is the loving thing to do is to act, whether it's in that riotous way or through some other form of collective struggle. But that in fact, they are not mutually exclusive. But that in fact, kind of a revolutionary love is to take action in one form or another. And I'll close out here because I have one more question for you. But James Jasper, sociologist, he has this idea, he calls them moral batteries, right? That, right, you have these two seemingly oppositional experiential or emotional responses. But that in fact, if you put them together, they can be really powerful catalysts for action. And so I've seen in my own work, in my own experience, in conversations that, right, that really it's that love and that rage is what, you know, love of the people and your community and wanting to make things better, right? But also outrage at the injustice and at the oppression, right? That can spark those important moments that you're looking at, those visceral responses.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I'm thinking that's one of the reasons I think a lot of people are afraid of those moments, even people who politically aren't opposed to rioting, who in the moment when that stuff's kicking off are afraid of it or afraid when it's happening, is because it sort of makes you touch feelings that you might not want to. I mean, both on the love and the rage side, and the heartbreak of, you know, of systemic violence, of oppression, of deprivation, of exploitation, and that going on in your communities and your loved ones and your ancestors. And like actually being able to touch this possibility of fighting back can be frightening also within the self emotionally. It can be really empowering. It can be scary. It's a lot of things at once. But I think that's a big part of what drives the this just sort of like emotional outbursts in these moments, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's what keeps us coming back for more, though, right? That feeling of that collective empowerment, that love on the ground, right? And also the rage at wanting to change things, and it can change lives, as you yourself point out. I could talk about this forever, but with an eye to time, I have to ask you, right? This book is, you know, so much more. It's not just academic research. This is, you know, kind of scholar activism at its best. It really provides us with kind of ideas that we need for building better movements, growing better movements in real ways. And looking at it as this kind of intervention into how we grow movement. I'm curious, what is it that you want organizers and folks in movements to take away from this work, right? It's clear what the academics need to be taking away from it, right? And fields like the civil resistance studies, right? You're flipping that on the head. But speak to us about right, all the important lessons for those of us involved on the ground too.
Yeah, I mean, it was a challenge, a fun challenge trying to write this book for multiple audiences, and it's something that I hope in the appendix, for example, I hope can help other folks think about how to do that in different ways. And I would hope this is just like, one drop in the bucket of the sort of stuff we need, and it's one drop among many others of folks who are doing similar type of scholar activism. And yeah, I'm hoping it can help with that trend. I guess. I mean, since I've been thinking recently about, since the 1970s, so like the last half century, I think, there's been a real turn away from ideological revolutionary struggle in left movements in the US. I think a turn toward professionalization, instrumentalization, nonprofitization, and that sort of prioritizes acute skills, specific sorts of capabilities over politics, over building a movement like a mass movement with politics. And the idea of strategic nonviolence, I think, has been part of that. It's not the only thing. I spent a lot of time criticizing strategic nonviolence. Hopefully in some of the Q&A, I can get into some of the things that I think are important about it, because the purpose of this work is not just to take a side in the violence nonviolence debate. It's to say that this debate is destructive. It's hurting our ability to see what's possible for movements. And I think that, it can make people think that there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. And we have to check in with the rule book. That's not true. I think, riots are one way of shattering that concept. It's a window into the long history of rebelliousness, that's simmering in all societies that are characterized by injustice and oppression and colonization, and it erupts in these moments in many ways. And riots are one of the most iconic, and the emotional power that those moments can capture, I think, is really important. They can fortify us, they can motivate us, they can remind us that that the struggle is real and the struggle exists, and we're losing, but we haven't lost. Like I say in the book, riots remind us that politics is still a fight. There's still people willing, to fight against forces of injustice, and they remind people on all sides of the barricades, as I say, the people who were involved in the uprising, the people who were on the other side, the police, and everyone who's watching. It reminds everybody that there's consequences to the way our society is being run, and we can use those struggles and the feelings that they produce as symbols that to help organize and mobilize and expand our horizons for what's possible to build a better world.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Part of what really meant so much to me while I was reading this book was the ways in which, and you were just speaking to this, the ways in which what you're really talking about is challenging our understanding of winning, in a sense, particularly when you were talking about the ways in which riots can transform people, and the ways in which it can show us what's possible. Exactly like you were just saying, that these riotous moments, these moments of collective struggle together, they open kind of a window to liberation, right? This is what freedom can feel like. And to me, that idea of that hope, and that experience of this is what freedom could be, is such an important lesson and story that you bring to the forefront there, because you're right, wins are few and far between, and we need to highlight the wins that are there that can sometimes be overlooked, and I think you do a wonderful job of doing that. And in general, this is just a fabulous book, and I'm just so honored to be here to help celebrate it and its debut. And I encourage everybody to run out there and get a copy of it, because it really is such an important new contribution to the conversation. So congratulations again, Ben.
Thank you so much, Hillary. And I'm really happy to be talking with you about this. And as you alluded to, we've been through a lot in studies and in struggles, and I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation with you, and also to hearing what questions other folks have.
Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah, great. I mean, I get the sense that this is a conversation that can go on for a long time. We're really only scratching the surface here, but it's been a really engaging conversation so far, and it looks like the audience thinks so too. There's lots of questions rolling in. So I'll jump right into them. It looks like, yeah, we've got about 25 minutes. So just a couple questions here. I'm going to start with this one first that is addressed to both Ben and Hillary. It comes from Dade. I'm guessing seems familiar with your work. But so for both Ben and Hillary, you've been colleagues and comrades for nearly a decade. Can you talk about some of the process of building theory and clarifying understanding together, and how your relationship as both thought partners and comrades has grown, how you have helped each other think and seen each other grow in all that time?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Dade. I don't know, Hillary, you want to take that? Should I start? I mean, yeah, it's a great question. It's partly, I don't know if I should credit or blame Hillary for being one of the people who got me involved in the grad program at the University of Pittsburgh, sociology department. But when I showed up there and I was considering that as a place to go and think about these things, it had a reputation as a movement department, and I had been recommended by a professor, different professor at Pitt. And I was there visiting, and everyone directed me to talk to Hillary, because Hillary was like the Occupy person and the anarchist and the one who was, involved in this stuff. And talking with you in your office when I was visiting was a big part of what convinced me that this was a good idea. That this, using a graduate program to develop these skills and to be able to make interventions that matter, that really can help movements, and doing it while we're organizing at the same time and trying to transform the university. We organized for a long time together doing labor organizing in the university. That's another big part of this, which, and I got to shout out, since we're talking about university struggles, the California grad workers who are on strike. And I just heard today that the new school is occupied by students who are supporting the faculty on strike, which is incredible. So yeah, shout out to all of them as well. But Hillary was one of the people who sort of like convinced me this was possible and this could work, and absolutely has been someone who was a guide for me, and in many ways a mentor as an activist intellectual, and a comrade and a thought partner since then. I don't know, Hillary, what
And you're gonna make me choke up over here. Yeah, you can blame or thank me, but yeah, I was asked to recruit Ben Case, who was coming to campus and was involved in movements and would bring such important things to the conversation in the department, and indeed they were right. Ben has pushed my thinking in so many ways over the years, both in struggle and in the classroom, and in part by raising this question of strategic nonviolence versus kind of the problems of kind of the efficacy of that pervasive myth, right? Yeah, sure, I was involved in the debates back in the day, but Ben was really the one making the case, like, no, we need to take this head on, and we can leverage this research to do this. And by extension, I would say, we were just talking about it, this idea of militant love. I'm going to say that it's in part the conversations with Ben over the years, right? By kind of infusing part of my thinking around love and its role in revolutionary action. He was really helping me to think about, oh, what is that relationship with militant struggle as well? Right. And to see that overlap and then, you know, to the point where I'm like very directly drawing on research that he's now been doing. So there's a direct linkage there. But then, and I want to create space for another question, but, you know, a big part of especially, you know, early grad school together was doing the organizing around the graduate student organizing campaign. And that was a, you know, very important movement for me personally, and the comrades that we made through that struggle. And it was really credit to you, Ben, because you said you were the one who behind closed doors said, you know what, we got to do this shit. So, really got that conversation started. So, immeasurable ways to date. There are immeasurable ways that working alongside Ben has been important to me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that, talking personal as well. I think it's important to bring into the room, into the conversation, you know, the power of these relationships, especially in these kinds of moments that we're talking about. So turning from relationships back to the book then, Lisa here asks, what is the most surprising result, finding, conclusion, or implication of the research in this book? I'm sure there are many, but maybe if you could pick one or two that really kind of stood out for you in the process, or Hillary in reading the book.
Yeah, there are many. And so what's the most? I mean, there were a lot of things that were surprising to me about the interview studies. That was a really, I'm really grateful to the folks that were willing to speak to me in that process. I learned a lot through that, and I think that there's a lot we can learn through, you know, partisan social science as people who are participants in movements who can engage in this sort of robust research, interviewing other people about their, you know, about their experiences, and helping to bring things out, you know, from their experiences that that can help us all understand struggle better. But I understood some of my own experiences a lot better based on those interview studies. And, you know, one of the reasons I sort of knew there was there to some of this stuff was because I've participated in the sorts of things that could get called nonviolent actions. And I've also participated in the sorts of things that could get called riots, you know, without incriminating myself, and, you know, but so I knew there was something there, but there was such a wealth of wisdom that came through the folks I spoke to in both the case studies, that I started seeing my own experiences in a different light. I started identifying feelings and ways that my own experiences have changed me that I had not noticed previous to that. Specifically around the real power of moments when you can sense that you're really breaking through the rules of authority, that you're really resisting in some sort of physical, material way with your comrades. There's the real lasting sense of possibility that's part of that, that I've gone back to and accessed in myself in difficult moments, but I hadn't realized I was doing that until I heard, until I heard other folks talk about the ways that they understood their lives to change, or that their relationship to struggle had changed based on those actions. So that was something that was, I suppose, one of the more surprising things for me.
Great. Hillary, did you have anything you wanted to share on that one? Or?
Oh, sure. You know, I think, and I spoke to this a little bit, the fact that I suddenly discovered all this overlap, and it had come out in conversations over the years, but quite directly that, you know, we were both, when I first discovered that we were both specifically talking about this effervescent effect, I thought, oh my God, Ben, we're doing the same project again. But the fact that we were both finding kind of independently through our conversations with people, the interviews, and our own self-exploration, that we were both thinking about this idea of the transformative power of being in struggle, the ways in which it brings these liberating and empowering experiences to people that are so deeply important. And really, I was just so struck by the similarities of what folks he interviewed with, what people that I've had conversations with, what they were saying. That same kind of, it was a beautiful moment, right? Yeah, it was deeply moving to read it in his text as well. And of course, I don't know if I was surprised by it, but I came away from reading the book like, dang, he really eviscerated those arguments that are so popular out there.
Yeah. And for me, Ben, earlier at the start of the discussion, you made a distinction between what we're actually calling a riot. You spoke to the political and like sociocultural context for which these kinds of events are happening. And I thought that was really helpful, because when people just say, people can mean various things when they're calling something a riot, whether it's, people at home watching it on their TVs, or it's the police and the state, declaring something a riot, or the sort of power that people are feeling in the streets. These are all different contexts. So one audience member asks about January 6th. And asks what you would classify the January 6th attack on the Capitol building like in your data set. And I think I'm interested to expand on that question, to ask, specifically about the right wing using these kinds of tactics. Like what is, if there were sort of popular social movements, leftist sort of actions in which we're adopting a more overt tendency towards more radical action, what is the danger then in sort of right-wing co-optation of those tactics and using them right back at people?
Yeah. I mean, I would just start with that part by saying like that danger is there. I don't think we create that danger by resisting or fighting back. That danger is absolutely there, and that danger has been there. That danger has been there for a long time. I think January 6th is that's a difficult moment. I mean, for a lot of reasons. But one thing, just to be clear, I don't categorize anything in my data that I'm working with. So in the book, the data that I work with for when I'm talking about riots and nonviolent demonstrations comes from a pre-existing data set. I just draw from that, and I run the numbers, I analyze the numbers. So for them, they're talking about a very specific criteria that has to involve at least 100 people and a certain amount of damage, and there's like this major riot kind of a thing. And for nonviolent demonstrations, has to involve more than 100 people. It's specifically anti-government, so that's still looking at this sort of like political direction of the riot. So that's for the data. But for me personally, the truth is, I think there's elements of both. It's a bit of a hybrid. I think that the part that's important to understand is there's a reason why they were able to do what they did that's political, right? And so, we all know the difference between the police response to January 6th and the police response to the racial justice protest that happened that summer. That was nonviolent there. And there's, just legions of armed police, armed to the teeth riot police there for that. You couldn't get anywhere near the Capitol. And there was way more people who were part of that than were there on January 6th. Couldn't get near the Capitol if they wanted to. They weren't trying to. January 6th was possible because it was allowed to happen. And the reason it's a hybrid is because it wasn't allowed to happen by all the cops who were physically there. There were cops trying to stop that. There were individual cops who were trying to find and who were injured and killed. So certainly it was a fight with some police. So it wasn't not that. But from just from an organizational level, there just wasn't the police to prevent that. And that's because of the political orientation of that crowd. And, I think it's very clear that the response before, during, and after that event would have been night and day different if it had been something else. I mean, the people who literally killed people in that instance, law enforcement, broke into the Capitol, are facing charges that are by and large, nothing compared to the charges that the folks faced on January 20th in 2017 at Trump's inauguration. Now, people are facing 70 years in prison for, setting a limousine on fire and breaking, like a McDonald's window, right? And again, that's because of the political disposition of that crowd. And so I think it's less of a hard distinction between one and another, and more of these are tools we can use to understand the political dynamics of what's happening in these moments that we might call a riot.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying all that. It's super helpful. Cool, let me see what else we've got here. There's an anonymous attendee who is curious to know how you measure the success of a movement, and like whether that can be generalized across struggles with less or more clearly defined aims.
That's a fantastic question. And it's something that I struggle with, to be honest with you. That's not really something that's part of this book for me. I mean, I can talk about the ways that that Chenoweth's data set categorized it, because again, I spent this ridiculous amount of time with that data. I mean, I probably could quote it line, word for word. They're specifically talking about the mechanism, the category of success. It has to do with maximalist struggle, and there's three parts to that. There's either overthrowing a government, there's ousting a foreign occupation, or there's seceding from a state. So it's a governmental shift is what they're looking at to measure success in that data set, the one that I'm critiquing. And that's one of the things I critique, frankly, is using those outcome measures. I think it's a problem. It's something that, to be perfectly honest, like I said, I struggle with this. I think that outcomes are important. Measuring wins are important. There's no doubt about it. We have to stand on our wins. We have to build towards something. We need goals. I agree with all those things. But measuring this hard, like win and not win, is a problem. I think that oftentimes movements that look like wins, even maximalist movements that look like wins, a couple of years later can look like something very different, and vice versa. I mean, these things can have multiple effects. I think it's important that whatever we call a win, I think it's important that we keep an eye on the various ways that we have opportunities coming off a win, a loss, whatever, to continue to advance the movement, and threats that are there to roll back successes. But I guess if I was pushed to it, I would say that if we're expanding freedoms and protections and rights and and safety and ability to live a decent life for everyone, but prioritizing people who are denied these things, prioritizing people who are marginalized and oppressed and systemically excluded from society, if we're measurably improving people's ability to live in those ways, and if we're taking chunks out of the systems that are keeping the current stratifications in place, then we're winning. But that's not a very satisfying answer. So yeah, it's something that I struggle with.
Sound like some pretty good goals to me. Some pretty good success if we're achieving that. Hillary, did you have anything you want to add?
Sure. I mean, I was going to agree with you, Ash. It sounded like a good answer to me, Ben. But that being said, and I can highlight another thing from Ben's work here. I really think that part of what Street Rebellion does, specifically when it is talking about the experiential element of the riot, is that it problematizes kind of the binary notion of success and failure in a movement in ways that can be disheartening and demoralizing if we hold on to kind of the binary conception of there's a single definition of success for a movement. Well, since those are few and far between, and the state is a formidable foe, right? that can feel deeply demoralizing. Will we ever truly win? And I think that is kind of a problematic way to look at things. And what Ben does, and what some of what I like to look at as well, is those moments of transformation for people and the ways in which they carry them out of the moment, out of that, whether it's the riotous moment or the moment of struggle, and into their lives and communities. And what I've come to think of as the ripple effect, I see it very much in play in what Ben is talking about, that people carry these moments forward, right? There's the saying, we carry a new world here in our heart, right? And to me, that's a form of winning, right? When we ourselves begin to see what is possible. And carry that into the ways in which we interact with others, the ways in which we kind of model different ways of being, different modes of being. And for me, that's not so much about the instrumental, did we win, did we lose in that moment, but how are we beginning to see liberation in our lives? And I think Ben's work implicitly very much points us in that direction. And it's a hopeful story.
Fantastic. Yeah, okay, so maybe we'll do one more question here. I think it's a good one to end on, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. So Caitlin just asked, first they say it's been so great to be in this virtual space with Hillary and Ben tonight. And they're wondering if you could talk about if there was anything that didn't make it into the book for the sake of space that you wish you could have included.
Oof. Yeah. So there's two versions of an answer I can think of. The first has to do with interview studies that concern things that are illegal. So I try to take a lot of precautions to protect the identities and security of the folks I spoke to. And that was part of actually one of the reasons that I ended up on this, looking at the emotional responses of these things. Actually was in some ways a happy accident, because that seemed to be an area of focus that was least likely to deal with like specifics of incriminating behavior. So like I'm not interviewing people about like what you did or what your friend did in this specific intersection in this thing. I'm interested in like how these moments felt. That seemed to be like one of the safer ways to go initially, and it ended up with this really producing this really interesting study. But the interviews also, I did get a lot of really, really juicy stuff that I didn't feel able to print for the sake of people's security, identity, but also just for the sake of like not stoking divisions within movements. There was some people talking some pretty glorious shit that I would have, like, a part of me, like a devil on one shoulder, would have loved to publish some of the stuff. There were some really juicy stories in a lot of ways that like, that's one of the burdens of being the sort of a researcher. I just have to like live with that in my head and not put it out into the world, because I think it could be damaging. And that's one of the things that, in balancing having a robust research study that's not I'm not trying to in any way skew the results. I want what comes out to be absolutely accurate. I think that's one of the most important things about militant research and partisan social sciences. We need accurate, real information to build movements on, and so that's important there. But also not wanting to contribute in any way to criminalization or people catching charges, certainly, but also like unnecessarily stoking tensions or internal issues between movements. So that was something that was difficult to withhold intentionally. And then otherwise, there's actually a few sections in the appendix where I include like things I would like to talk more about, but I just didn't see a way they would make it in. And they're all really important things. And it's like, I think there could be a lot more separately on race. I think there could be a lot more on gender. I think there could be a lot more on class. These are all areas that are like really important, deeply wound up in questions of violence and nonviolence. and movement building. And I sort of gave some initial thoughts in those sections and cited some other folks who I think do a really good job of talking about that and like hoping to inspire more conversations in those directions. But I don't really use any of those lenses as like a holistic way to approach these ideas. And I think that could have happened. I think the book could have been written with any of those focuses and could have been really good. There's another area specifically about repression, about the sort of like interplay between police and security forces and protesters and rioters. I think that there's a lot of area to develop on looking at those as sort of as an interplay, looking at what both of those sides are doing, both of the tactics they're deploying, how that escalates or de-escalates, or how that leads to different things. There's a lot of interesting stuff that came out that I didn't really go in that direction, but those are all things that I would have loved to include more, and hopefully either I will or hopefully others will in the future. Yeah, thanks for the question. Like thanks for all the questions. And yeah, this is just I'm really happy to be here, and that this is out in the world, and looking forward to even more really fruitful discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. We're about at time, so we'll start wrapping up. But for folks who are here, anyone who registered for this event, you'll get a follow-up email with a recording to the event, so you'll be able to check it out again. Share it with all the folks you go to your next protest with. Have some good discussion about all the kinds of tactics that are on the table and what's effective, not falling into the same old conversations and debates that we've probably all been a part of in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, hopefully move towards more wins, more success here. So yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much, Ben and Hillary, for coming with some really great questions, and Ben for writing the book. It's quite an achievement. I think it'll be a great resource for people today and in the future.
Thanks, Ash, so much for hosting this, and thanks, Hillary, and everybody for attending. Please feel free, if you have other outstanding questions, by the way, please feel free to follow up with me, and I'm really excited to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Ash, and Firestorm, and of course, Ben, thanks to you, and congratulations one more time.
Awesome, thanks y'all.
Right.
Hope to see you somewhere down the line in the future. We're getting lots of folks commenting in the chat, to being thankful, and thanking you for the discussion. So yeah, I hope you have a good rest of your night.
Thanks, you too.
All right, goodbye everyone.
Bye.